Okay, so here we are in our third lecture, second lecture proper, really. And we're going to look at the role of merchant capital and the rise of capitalism, specifically how we make that transition from feudalism, which we looked at last class, into what becomes and we start to understand as increasingly capitalistic practices. And then eventually, toward the end of the lecture, we'll look at how merchants are able to convert what they've been sort of doing in a kind of carrying trade into production, and eventually the rise of sort of industrial capitalism. So before we get started, let's just maybe recap where we looked at last class. So last class, of course, we looked at the sort of crisis of late feudalism is basically where we left off. We looked at features of the sort of feudal mode of production. What dominated in terms of the feudal mode of production was a kind of subsistence economy where peasants especially, and sometimes serfs, produced crops mostly to live in subsistence. There wasn't the kind of widespread commercial agriculture. It was basically unfree labor practices at this point. Serfdom, which existed all over Europe, even sort of in England, although it leaves England much quicker than the rest of Europe. It starts to erode in Western Europe, and of course it predominates in Eastern Europe and essentially exists there until even the mid-19th century, specifically in areas like the Ukraine and Russia. Now, we of course begin to see cracks in the system emerge that happen as a result of this crisis of late feudalism. We see sort of the effect of the Black Death, that we get a kind of ecological and demographic collapse. This leads to a sort of greater bargaining power from the point of the peasants. We get peasants' revolts, we get the rise of towns and cities, and we get a consolidation of landholding, particularly in England, right? We talked about last class how sort of these feudal lords were able to kind of take over land that had previously been the domain of peasants. Of course, half of the peasant population, just like the population of Europe, no longer exists, largely because the Black Death wiped out millions of people in upwards of 60% of the European population. And this eventually leads to what we know as the Enclosure Movement, where these sort of local feudal lords eventually, after they consolidate their hold on a lot of the land, start to enclose it. Common land is increasingly eliminated with parcels of land, and what we get is a kind of nexus of feudal lord, tenant farmer, and wage labor. And this is where we get really the emergence of commercial agriculture in the English countryside, which creates a few sort of key things that are necessary to get a kind of transition to capitalism in England. First, of course, is greater sort of efficiencies, because they're sort of operating more on market imperatives rather than sort of producing for feudal rights. We get the rise of a national economy at this point, or especially a national market in England. And because of these sort of labor efficiencies and the use of wage labor and the sort of the dispossession of peasants from the land, you have this large force of sort of landless, masterless people who now can't live a subsistence lifestyle and are forced to buy commodities in order to sustain their life and survive. And the only way you can buy commodities, of course, is with cash. So wage labor becomes predominant. One, because tenant farmers who have an increasingly market-oriented outlook start hiring them. And also, they can't actually purchase things without money. So now peasants have to work for wages, initially in the countryside as sort of, basically doing the same thing, but for wages. And of course, this creates two simultaneous markets, a market for labor on the one hand and a market for commodities. Laborers no longer are able to live a subsistence lifestyle and therefore must buy commodities as opposed to growing it or producing it themselves. And to do that, they have to sell their labor. So you get the creation of two simultaneous markets. And eventually, of course, the efficiencies in commercial agriculture lead these sort of masterless people that emerge in the countryside and have no access to land eventually move into towns and cities. And this sort of provides the labor force for what will become the sort of reorganization of production in sort of the towns and cities. And essential to this sort of reorganization is what we call the prefigurative elements of feudalism, right? The elements that exist kind of on the margins of feudal society, but once we get that transition to capitalist mode of production, become central to the system. And it is, of course, merchants and trade, and urban handcrafts. Now, initially, merchants, of course, are simply engaged in what we call the carrying trade, buying cheap and selling dear. And they do create a lot of money, what could potentially be called capital, but there's very little incentive initially for them to reinvest that capital into production. Mostly what they do is reinvest it in trade. But with the emergence of a labor market and a market for commodities, merchants increasingly look to invest in production, which of course they do. And there's a sort of transitional phase where we look at sort of the putting out system, where you do have a kind of hybrid system where workers are not completely dispossessed from the means of production. They do own, in many cases, their own tools, but do not control resources and ultimately are producing for a local merchant. This eventually, of course, leads to a more of a factory system, which comes a lot later. And that's a lot of what we're going to look at today. And even though there was this drive for merchants to acquire wealth, as the quote here on the slide says, it wasn't necessarily translated into a drive to create capital. And of course, the difference between wealth and capital is you can have wealth, but it's not really capital unless you're putting it to work, right? Unless you have money that you then say, I want to reinvest in something. And again, if you did reinvest it, you probably reinvested it in trade. And of course, if we go to the next slide here, the trading networks that existed in this period were extensive. Here again is a reminder of what the 13th century world system looked like, these sort of interconnected areas of trade and trading networks. We see trading networks with China and Southeast Asia, sort of the Eastern Indian Ocean between what is today Indonesia and the east coast of India, the west coast of India, and sort of the east coast of Africa and Arabia, the Persian Gulf area, sort of the land Silk Road across Central Asia. Sort of carrying trade between what is Egypt and Somalia along the Red Sea, and of course sort of the Mediterranean trade that is largely dominated by the Venetians and trading with spices between what were the Islamic empires, later the Ottoman Empire, and providing that to the rest of Europe, where lots of fortunes were made. So this is sort of what we looked at when we first encountered merchants and their role in the transition from feudalism. Today, what we're going to look at is how merchants become invested in production, specifically how they make the jump from trading, right? Some with these sort of vast trading networks, as we just talked about, that persisted everywhere. In China, in the Islamic empires, in India, in Northern Africa, in the Mediterranean, in sort of Northern Europe, the Hanseatic League, which we'll talk a little bit about today, and of course the Venetians and the sort of Northern Italian city-states like Florence, Siena, and Genoa. Now, to understand how some of these merchants made the jump from trade to small-scale production to more sort of rationalist capitalist forms of production, and then eventually industrial capitalism, we will, toward the end of today's lecture, turn our attention to the United States, which centered on the readings you had this week. And we'll examine a case study of Lynn, Massachusetts. And it provides a really interesting sort of small-scale look at how a sort of, in this case, a particular town, which was known for the production of shoes, how it moved from that artisanal system of production into first a sort of commercial capitalist form of production, and then much later industrial capitalism. And again, that's sort of key to know and to emphasize here. And I'll try to emphasize this more throughout the lecture, which is when we think about capitalism in terms of production, right? And I said this last class, most of us think of technological change. And that certainly is true. That's more true in the mid to late 19th century than it is in the 18th and early 19th century. What you have to get before we get sort of these sort of technological innovations really is about organizational innovations. And a lot of what we'll look at today is how merchants were able to rationalize a system of production. And once they do that, then they can start investing in new technologies to further rationalize production and become a lot more productive, and then create larger markets and create more capital, and then take that capital, reinvest it into improved technology, greater rationalization and organization, and eventually, of course, we get that sustained capitalist takeoff, first in England, also in the United States as it's exported from England, and then from there it spreads throughout the world. Now, before we get into that, I think it's worth looking at merchant capital that existed beyond Europe. And we're going to look at sort of two case studies. We're going to look at China, specifically the Sung and the Ming dynasties. And then after that, we will look at the Islamic empires. how these sort of how merchant capital operated in those areas, and we'll also look at why in Ming China and the Islamic empires, where you had these sort of intense trading networks, and in the case of China, quite a lot of production, albeit artisan production. Why weren't merchants in these areas able to take control of production and then rationalizing it along capitalistic lines? And why, for example, in England and the United States, it actually does move from this sort of artisanal mode of production to a more capitalistic mode. All right, so we'll stop the video there, and in the next video we will look at China, and then I'm not sure if it will be one video, depending on how long it takes. It might be two, and then after that we will look at the Islamic empires, and then from there we'll go back to Europe, which is sort of a latecomer. In many cases, Europe is usually a latecomer. And then from Europe, we will then focus on a case study of Lynn, Massachusetts, and look specifically how merchants were able to convert themselves into sort of eventually industrial capitalists.